Ladies and gentlemen, if you want to build yourself a gaming PC, then first things first, you need to understand what all of the gaming PC parts are in a system, what they do, what you should be buying, and ultimately what are the things to go for, and what are the things to definitely avoid. And the good news is that in this video, we're going to get hands-on with literally everything that goes in a gaming PC. We're going to look at things like Intel, AMD, Nvidia, sizes, compatibility, price, value, all of these things, and we're going to help you to understand every single one of them. So if you are going to build yourself a gaming PC, or at least get someone else to build it for you, then you know exactly which parts you should actually be going for. And the good news is this is part one of a three-part, maybe a four-part series, where we actually show you how to build a gaming PC from scratch. It's going to be really exciting, so let us walk you through absolutely everything you need to know about every single gaming PC component right after a short word from this video's sponsor. Corsair's 3500 series of cases have arrived, and they offer a whole new view into PC gaming. With tempered glass on both the side and the front, this affordable chassis lets your PC sing. And thanks to its modest footprint, it'll fit on most desks without compromise. Cooling is no problem either, with the ability to fit a whopping 10 fans and 2 radiators when using 120s, or 7 140s if that's more your bag. Learn more about this incredible case today with the link down below. Well then everyone, first things first, if you are watching this video then congratulations, because clearly you do have an interest into getting into PC gaming, or at least getting hands-on with the components yourself. And let me just say, it is the best hobby in the world. As you can probably guess, I absolutely love it, and if you are seriously considering making the switch from console to PC, or just getting back into it, you're not going to regret it. It is fantastic. But having said that, it is more complicated than console gaming, partly really because you need to understand what it is that you're buying. And yes, obviously the asking price on some of these components can get quite expensive, but the good news is there are loads of budget-friendly components you can get too, and obviously if you are willing to go on the used market, you can buy second-hand things for a real bargain. So don't worry about it too much, just plan your build properly. And what I always say to people is to look at the graphics card first. So you can buy pretty much one of 3 brands, and they almost have sub-brands as well. So this is an AMD Radeon graphics card, this is an Nvidia GeForce graphics card, and in my magic pile over here, we also have one from Intel. And these are quite new. The last time I did this video, they didn't exist. So it's nice to see that we have 3 choices. Now, this is an Intel Arc card, but as you've probably noticed, there's another brand on the box. So this one, it says ASRock, this one says Palette, and this one says Power Color. And essentially what happens is the GPU, the graphics processing unit, is manufactured by your AMD's, Nvidia's, Intel, and then it's actually shipped off to the vendor that will then manufacture the card and sell it to you. So this is why it's made by Palette, but it is an Nvidia graphics card, because they make the GPU, and then, as I say, Palette or whoever decides to actually make the graphics card. And they come in various different shapes and sizes, and compatibility is pretty much twofold really. Firstly, you need to make sure that it can physically fit in your case. This is a smaller one here, so if you go for a massive graphics card, obviously this isn't going to work properly. You also need to make sure that you can power it properly. There is a power supply recommendation somewhere on the back of your system. Here, look, it says minimum 800 watts. This is going to be your best guide, but you can use online calculators to work out exactly how much power you need. But then also you do need to make sure that your motherboard is up to date enough that it can actually accept the PCIe speed of the graphics card you're buying. And this actually isn't usually an issue if you're buying a new system, but if you're wanting to upgrade an older one, this is more where it comes into account. So you know what, actually, let's make this really messy and do a horrible jump cut. I will grab the card in question really that we're talking about. As a good example, this is an RTX 4060, and it uses a PCIe Gen 4 like graphics PCIe slot, and if you put this inside a motherboard that has PCIe Gen 3, the speed of this card will be reduced. It won't be able to operate at its full speed. It's not really something that most people, as I say, need to worry about, mainly if you're upgrading from an older system or buying used, but just essentially look at the motherboard that you're getting, check the PCIe version, and then check the PCIe version on the graphics card, and then just make sure they are the same and you won't have any issues. But of course, the question really that I get asked more than anything else when it comes to graphics is what brand is best. And when it comes to the sub-brands, so your Asus, your MSIs, Palette, Gigabyte, it's more or less on a card-by-card basis, and I would always read the reviews, and if I was sort of torn between a couple, the main things really that I would look for was a card that ran quietly, had a long warranty, and obviously was more affordable. There's no point spending loads of money on a graphics card that is essentially going to be the same, because when you look at the numbers, these are the main things really that you need to look at. The model name. So this is the RX 7800 XT. This is a upper mid-range graphics card, so you can go higher than this, and generally speaking, the higher the number, the better the card is. But you do also need to pay attention to this one here, which is the amount of VRAM This is the amount of VRAM that it has. So 16 gigabytes is great. Generally speaking, for a budget-friendly card, you're looking at 8 gig. For mid-range, 12 gig, and then high-end 16 or more. It's going to depend on the resolution you play. As I say, you should be looking at getting the highest number really that you can afford, but the biggest question really is going to come down to whether you want to go for AMD, Nvidia, or Intel. And actually it's very easy because I've literally just made a video all about the best combinations for this. You can find that in the top right corner of your screen, and we go through the best cards at the best price points. But I'm aware that it's better to give you knowledge on how to work this out for yourself, especially if this video is going to age and not be redundant as soon as new cards come out. Essentially, at the time of filming, I would say Nvidia is the best all-rounder because they have some exclusive features like DLSS, better ray tracing, and then their DLSS frame generation feature. And they lock this behind a Nvidia paywall. So if you have an Nvidia graphics card, you can use it. If you have an Intel or you have an AMD graphics card, these features are locked and it will not work if you buy those cards. Whereas if you go for an Intel card or you go for AMD, they have their own technologies. So Intel has XeSS, AMD has quite a few different ones, but their main one really is FSR and FSR frame generation. But these are open source, so you can actually use these regardless of the graphics card that you go for. So if you go for an Intel card, you can use FSR. If you go for an AMD card, you can use XeSS. If you're going for an Nvidia card, you can use both of them. So for that reason, Nvidia tends to charge a little bit of a premium on their cards, which for some people is definitely going to be worth it, but for others, not so much. General rule of thumb, if you're looking to play multiplayer games, I'd say actually AMD graphics cards usually offer the best bang for buck. If you're going for a budget-friendly GPU, then actually something like this Arc A580 or an Arc A750 is a great option, but because Intel is newer, you can run into issues with certain titles where they don't run as well. Now, it is a lot better with Intel than it was at launch, but this is something I would still be aware of, really. AMD is typically a bit of a safer option, but Intel typically, depending on the price that you get it for, can offer the best value at the more budget-friendly side of things. If you're looking at something super high-end, so maybe like a RTX 4070, 4080, 4090, then Nvidia pretty much have the best cards available. They will run games better than AMD, but again, this is only when you take the Nvidia exclusive features into account. So if you're running things like ray tracing, which will give you better visuals, if you're running their upscaling technologies like DLSS, their frame gen, Nvidia will typically offer the best experience. But as I say, if you're running like a pure game without any of these extra settings on, then actually AMD tends to work better. They offer more VRAM for the same price a lot of the time, and they just offer better value for money. If you want to see, as I say, the best graphics cards you can buy, I've also done that video in the top right corner of your screen. So that is the graphics card then, and this is definitely the most important part of your gaming PC because it is going to dictate your frame rate in most games that you play. The better the graphics card, the smoother it will be, the higher the FPS, the higher you can turn up the settings. Always prioritize that above pretty much anything really. However, don't forget that your other components are still really important and you can't cut corners too much or you will run into problems. And there's this little battle going on all of the time when you fire up a game really, and essentially it's called the bottleneck. So your performance in game will be dictated by the weakest component, and typically speaking, it's a dog barking. As I was saying, Postman aside, essentially the weakest part of your PC will dictate the frame rate that you get. Now, usually this comes down to 3, sometimes 4 components, and the most important one is the graphics card, but then in the second place is actually our CPU. So this one is an Intel chip, this one is an AMD Ryzen chip, but at the time of filming, it's pretty much the case that Intel uses the highest amount of power, so you're going to have to spend more money on a better cooler to keep this running cool. The chips are already quite expensive as well, so in combination with the cooler, it is going to mean that you're going to be paying a little bit more money. But the benefit actually with Intel is that you typically get more cores while still having some of the best gaming performance you can get. And more cores are going to be better for multitasking or some of the latest and greatest titles that properly utilize them. We've spoken about CPU cores before. You can find my full video in the top right corner of your screen that actually shows how CPU cores impact gaming performance, but the cheat sheet really is that you need 8. 8 is ideal. Any more than 8, it doesn't really make much difference. Like 6 is absolutely fine. If you're on a real budget, then 4 will suffice, but 6 or 8 is pretty much the sweet spot at the moment. However, if you are going to be doing other things, as I say, like creating videos or I don't know, using Photoshop or anything really that can properly utilize more cores efficiently. Things like Blender. Photoshop actually isn't too bad for core usage. But anyway, if you're doing productivity, having a larger amount of CPU cores is going to be more beneficial, but it doesn't always translate into better gaming performance. However, again, when you're playing a game and it says preloading textures, if this is something that annoys you, if you have more cores, this is typically going to be completed faster, but you usually only need to do this once or twice per game over the course of its lifetime, so it's not really that important, to be honest. But of course, alternatively, you can go for the other option, which is going for Team Red, which is AMD with their Ryzen CPUs. The main differences really between the two is obviously, as I say, these have more cores, these typically have less, and as a result, they don't generate as much heat, but the way that it actually works on Intel is that they split their cores into what they call efficient cores, which are much smaller and don't have as much performance, and then the real big thirsty boys, sounds a bit weird, they're performance cores. So typically you have 6 or 8 performance cores and then a load of efficient cores. So this is an i9, obviously very high end. Typically most people need an i5 or an i7 really for gaming, and when it comes to AMD, you're looking at a Ryzen 5 or a Ryzen 7. So this is actually the best all-round CPU you can buy at the time of filming. It will soon be replaced by the 9800 X3D and, as I say, the new Intel Ultra chips. But essentially Ryzen CPUs have always been, well, they were typically the underdog, and at the moment these tend to be the best all-round chips for gaming, which is great because obviously it means that you're going to get better performance for less. Something like the Ryzen 7600 is a 6-core chip. It's an amazing gaming CPU, as is the Ryzen 7 7700 and this, which is the 7800 X3D. This is an 8-core chip, but it has what they call their 3D V-cache technology, which essentially just has more cache on the CPU, which actually results in better frame rates for gaming, which is fantastic. But AMD seem to have got a little bit lazy with their most recent launch of Ryzen 9000, and at the time of filming, which is when they've just come out, they tend to be a lot more expensive and they don't offer that much more performance. But if you're watching this in 2025, then hopefully the prices would have sort of like matured a little bit and we can start to recommend them. But yes, the Ryzen chips are very good. It's typically what I recommend at the moment and typically what I use in my personal systems, but it's going to be exciting to see what Intel do. Now, one of the most important things when it comes to a gaming PC specifically though, is to not over or underspec your CPU. A mistake a lot of people make with their gaming PC is that they spend loads of money on their CPU. So maybe they spend £400 or dollars on a CPU and then £400 on a graphics card. But that wouldn't actually be the right way of doing it because you need to match the performance levels of the two and they are not priced equally. So as a general rule, I would say if you're spending around about £400 on a graphics card, you probably only need to be spending about 225. That's how much the Ryzen 7600 is. I realize that's a bit of a random number on your chip. Don't spend the same amount on both. It's always worth looking at benchmarks because, as I say, the more you spend on a graphics card, usually the more your performance goes up. But if you have a really good CPU, but your graphics card is arguably weaker, remember what I said about the bottlenecking? The lowest performance number will dictate what you actually get in game. And quite often, or more often than not, this is going to be down to the graphics card. So you could put an £800 CPU with a £200 graphics card and your performance will be all the way down here despite spending loads of money on a processor. So don't get carried away with this, but as I say, we've done more videos on this that explain it in much better detail. But of course, once you have chosen your CPU, you will then need to start thinking about a motherboard. And this essentially is the base for everything else to sit upon. You don't need to spend masses on this, and this is where companies like Asus, I think, can make a lot of money because they stack all of these features on top of boards. And again, especially if you're new to PC gaming, you might be thinking, well, if I spend £400-500 of dollars on a motherboard, it will be better, I'll get more performance. But actually, unless you're overclocking, most motherboards tend to offer the same level of performance really, unless you're looking at something really cheap. This is actually a video that I've been wanting to make for ages, where we can sort of showcase the real differences. But once you've spent over $200, $250, that sort of mark, most of the time the performance is pretty similar. And what you then start buying are more features, more future-proofing, more ports like Wi-Fi, USB 4, things like this. This is actually a brand new one from AMD. And again, we have two different vendors. Remember, it's AMD that kind of like license the socket. AMD obviously make the chip, so these two are cross-compatible, but then you have a different brand that will make the board. So this one is Asus Republica Gamers, but you can get ones from MSI, Gigabyte, ASRock, NZXT, Colorful even make motherboards now, like a load of different motherboards anyway from loads of different vendors. The most important thing is to make sure that the socket is the same for both of the chips. Like, as long as you do that, generally speaking, it should be compatible as long as the BIOS on the board is up to date. And what used to happen is that motherboard manufacturers would bring out new motherboards every single year and people would just buy the new board and the new chip together. But what's happening now really is that people buy a motherboard, they keep it for a while, and then as long as you're buying something that has USB BIOS flashback utility, sometimes it's called QFlash Plus, essentially on the back of the board, I mean actually we can open this one up and show you, as long as it has that USB flashback utility, then you can keep using this for ages, and if you do get a new chip, you don't have to have an existing CPU to flash the motherboard and update it, because it's quite simple really. If you buy a motherboard that came out in 2024, but then you buy a chip that comes out in 2025, how is that motherboard supposed to know what it is and why is it going to work? It's not. So if you look on the back of this, you should see we have this little USB port that says BIOS, and then there's a button on it as well that says BIOS flashback. So you get the new BIOS, you put it on a USB flash drive, whack it in this, get it powered on, don't turn the system on, but obviously get it like plugged in, and then you press this button, you hold it down for a few seconds, it will flash the motherboard, then you can put a new chip inside this. So when AMD come out with their 10,000 chips or whatever they're going to be called, there's a very strong chance that this motherboard is going to be compatible with it, but you will have to do the motherboard update in order to get it to work. But the reason I bring this up is because if you're buying like a older generation motherboard, so something like a B650 motherboard from AMD, and you buy a Ryzen 9000 chip, you will have to do this. It's quite common. The main things really that you need to know at the top end motherboards, so AMD call them their X series, so as I say, this is X870, whereas over on Intel you have their Z series, but I realized that I've actually picked up a B series board, and these sit below the Z and then the X series. Obviously they're not cross-compatible, but they sound quite similar. So this is a B760 motherboard, and we also have an AMD B board. This one is a B650, and typically speaking, these are what we'd recommend. The main difference is really on the Intel side of things, that their Z series can overclock the CPU. The B series, or at least at the time of filming, cannot. Whereas on AMD, you can overclock on all of them, but you'll have potentially better support on the X series, but both of them will have more bandwidth, which just usually means they have more features. They add more things onto the board. Things like Thunderbolt, for instance, could be on a higher end board. And this is when I say, if you need any of these features, things like 10 gig Ethernet, for example, you should already know that you need it. So look for a board that has those features. Whereas for most people, I would say just buy a solid B series motherboard for around about £200 or dollars or so, depending on your budget. And that's a real good bedrock actually to build a gaming system. But the reason I have these three boards is because you also need to bear in mind the size of the motherboard. Also bear in mind whether it has Wi-Fi. If you need Wi-Fi, buy a board that has Wi-Fi. But this is a full size motherboard. This is ATX. If you go for a really high end one, again, performance is probably not going to be different, but with more features, you can get what's called eATX, which is just slightly wider. It has the same hole structure, so when we put it inside a case, you'll still have the same holes, but there's just more on the board, so it's slightly wider, so you will need to check your case compatibility. We also have micro ATX, and these motherboards are obviously a little bit smaller, which means that they will go in smaller size chassis. You can put a MATX motherboard inside an ATX case, but you can't do it the other way around, obviously compatibility. So this, for example, is an ITX chassis. They have brought out a revision of this that does take a micro ATX motherboard, but this is one of the early ones. This would not physically fit in there. You couldn't do that, and even if you could, as we discovered when we actually tried it, you wouldn't want to because it's too big, and instead you'd want to go for an ITX motherboard, which when we put over the overhead, you shall see is pretty diddy. They're really quite cute, aren't they? And I always think it looks quite funny when you pick up a really big GPU, and this is quite literally what it will look like when you put it inside your system. The graphics card is way, way bigger than the main board. But I mean, to be fair, most of that is just a cooler anyway, right? Because it generates a lot of heat. But yes, those are the main motherboard features really that you need to be aware of. Just make sure you're buying one that has the same socket as the CPU. Make sure that the BIOS is up to date. Generally speaking, you want to have some cooling around the VRMs just to make sure that it can withstand a decent amount of power. But again, if you read reviews, they should summarize this for you. And then also note how many RAM slots it has, because if you go for a board like this, which is ITX, you typically only have 2, which is fine for most people, but when you want to upgrade your RAM at a later date, if you have 4 slots, it makes it easier because you don't have to swap out the RAM you've got. Just buy 2 more identical sticks, whack it in, and then you should be fine. The only other thing really that you need to think about, to be fair, All right, there's a few things to think about. You need to, again, remember that PCIe speed of the motherboard and make sure that's the same as the graphics card. But then also with SSDs, you need to make sure that it has a right amount of SSD slots for your personal needs. So the more storage you're going to have, the more drives. Obviously, you need a larger board really, and one that can actually take those drives, because if you go for an ITX and you want to put like 6 PCIe SSDs inside this, obviously not going to work. Only other thing really to bear in mind is also to make sure that it has all the headers that you need. So if you're putting loads of fans inside your system, more fan headers are better. These are your addressable RGB pins. So if you want to have loads of RGB devices, obviously you want more of these. Those are your fan headers. These are SATA ports. We don't really use these. Those are for older hard drives and SSDs. This one is quite important, USB 3.1. Typically speaking, most cases have a port for this, and most boards that you're going to buy have one of these now. This is to get USB-C on the front panel, but if you buy particularly an AM4 motherboard, quite often it won't have one of these, and then if your case has one, you're out of luck. You have to buy adapters and you don't get the full speed. If you're going for like a water cooling system, but you probably wouldn't be watching this video, make sure it also has some thermal sensors on it where you can actually plug your probes in, and then you can put this into like a water cooling loop and monitor the temperature, but most people don't need to worry about that. Oh, the power of editing, everyone. Nice and tidy, but let's now make a mess again and actually talk to you about memory. And obviously there's two different kinds really that you're going to have in your system, one being random access memory and the other one being the NAND flash, your SSD, the solid state drive. If you are carrying over an older system, then you're probably going to have either one of these or one of these, and the good news is all boards pretty much are entirely cross-compatible, so you can still put these inside your system. Hard drives, they still sell, and these are great really for like storing pictures and music and any large files that you don't need, but where possible, I would keep these away from a modern day gaming PC because they vibrate and it's quite annoying, especially if you're going to have it on your desk. If you can invest in a NAS like I do, that is going to be better. You can have multiple hard drives for redundancy. You know, most gamers, I think a lot of them will still have a hard drive in their system, but do be aware that a lot of modern games now won't actually work if you run it from this, or at least that they will run, but they're stuck to a lot of the time, and then it will catch up with itself just because the assets can't stream in quick enough. Moving up from that, we have our SATA SSD. Those have the SATA ports that we talked about earlier on the motherboard. They connect with a SATA cable. We need to power them as well. But generally what you want is to go for a SSD that's PCIe Gen 4, costs around about £60 or dollars or so, and you'll probably notice that some of them will come with what we call a heatsink like this one. It's a NM790 from Lexar. This is going to be good for putting in like a PlayStation 5, or if you have a motherboard that doesn't actually already have a heatsink cover for your SSD. This is just going to obviously help to dissipate the heat. Whereas if you, well, to be honest, if you buy a motherboard, most motherboards now have so many different heat sinks, especially the higher end ones, that you actively want to buy one that doesn't come with a heat sink because it will look cleaner and tidier, to be honest with you, but it depends on price. They're usually a little bit more expensive. Instead, you can go for something like this. This one is the Samsung 990 Pro. I'd always recommend buying one that's high end but on sale, as you usually get the best value. And technically, this label is a heat sink, but I mean, not really, to be honest with you. You definitely want to make sure that you do put this in some kind of cooling solution just to keep it in check. There's a few different speeds. PCIe Gen 3 is absolutely fine if you're on a real budget, but Gen 4 drives are faster and you can typically find them for a really good price to the point where they are worth buying. PCIe Gen 5 SSDs, they're still too expensive really to recommend for gamers because you're not going to properly be able to utilize that speed. Around about 5,000 on the reads and writes is ideal. Anything more than that, you're not really going to notice that much. But if you can buy one that actually has cached on it, that is going to help with everyday performance as well. But it depends what you're using your PC for. I would also advise going for a terabyte or larger, just because games these days, the real big ones can be between like 120, 150 gig. So if you have a 500 gig SSD, especially if you've got slower internet, you're gonna have to delete games a lot of the time. It's gonna be really annoying. 500 is fine on a budget, but a terabyte or two is definitely the way I would go. So that is what your storage looks like. And the beauty as well of those is that they literally just connect into the motherboard. They don't require any sort of power or anything like separate, no cables. You literally just whack them in and then the motherboard takes care of everything, including the power. But obviously the main difference between going for storage and going for RAM, you will of course need both, is that what you store on your SSD is permanent, or at least as permanent as you can get these days. Obviously failures and things can happen, whereas RAM tends to be quite a lot faster, has lower latency, but obviously it's refreshed every single time you turn your PC on and off. When you put your PC to sleep, that is actually like saving your PC state in RAM and then it's loading it back in. And actually a good analogy to like think about how your PC works is the cache, and we spoke about this earlier, you can get extra cache on one of those Ryzen X3D chips. The cache is kind of like stuff that you're holding in your hands. So the CPU, it's got everything it needs here, whereas if I need to, say, pick something up from the table, this is the RAM. So it's still pretty quick. It's not as quick as holding it in my hand, but I pick that up, that's from my RAM. Whereas stuff that I have on a drive, that's the equivalent of me going behind me, going into my cupboard and taking a fan out. Now, I'm not sure that many CPUs are literally going to turn around and get a fan out of their cupboard, but that is quite a good idea of showing you that even though that's still pretty fast and I didn't have to wait very long, if I need something right now, which your CPU does to run all of the instructions, that's why having larger cache can help, because it's got more stuff it can work with quickly. You don't have that latency for actually to sort of fetch everything that it needs because it's already got it. Obviously I'm simplifying, but essentially that's the way it works. But that was kind of a little bit of a tangent really, because we were talking about the random access memory, and it's come along quite a long way really in the last few years. The main thing really to bear in mind is DDR5 versus DDR4. Now, pretty much all new motherboards-ish, probably again by the time you're watching this, are going to be DDR5 only. So AM5, the AMD boards, they're all DDR5 now. Intel, most boards are DDR5, some of them are DDR4. If you go for an older generation AM4 motherboard, those are all DDR4. And the reason I say you need to be aware of this is because they're not cross-compatible. They physically will not fit in the same slots, which I'm sure has caught loads of you guys out watching this. Let me know in the comments if that's happened to you. And you can do a little bit of a cheat sheet as well, because the faster and the lower latency the memory, in theory, the better your performance is going to be. But remember we spoke about bottlenecks? Well, RAM is also a bottleneck, and if you don't have fast enough memory and you've got a really fast CPU and GPU, this can hold you back. But generally speaking, it's more likely going to be your graphics card or your CPU that will restrict your performance. But the performance between these two are quite closely tied, because don't forget, the faster a CPU runs is kind of dependent on how quickly it can access everything that it needs. So if you've got loads of cache, then the memory is arguably less important, whereas if you don't have loads of cache on your CPU, then fast memory and low latency memory obviously is going to make more sense. But the cheat sheet is that you're typically looking at 6,000 megahertz really, with a latency of maybe 32, 36. Do I mean 32 or do I mean 30? As close to 30 as possible is typically going to be your best bet for the best performance. If you're on Intel, however, feel free to go above 6,000 megahertz. It's not a problem, but it's kind of a game of diminishing returns really, because whilst you can get more performance from faster and lower latency memory, it starts to get really expensive because most people will buy a kit around about 6,000 megahertz, so the yields on those will be higher because they sell more and the price of those can be lower. Whereas when you have like a SKU that's sold less, like a 7,400 megahertz kit or something like that, as I say, the price goes up and then it's not really worth it, because you'd be better off putting that money towards a better graphics card or a better CPU rather than spending all of that on memory. So yes, generally speaking, look for 6,000, maybe a CAS of 30, 36. That's going to be your best way to go. Oh, and capacity, we probably should say about that as well. 16 gig is fine if you're on a real budget, especially on DDR4 systems, but if you're on a DDR5 system, then 32 is going to be pretty much the best bang for your buck really. You're looking at between 90 and 110 pounds or dollars really for most kits. And obviously if you go for RGB, that is going to cost you more, but it arguably looks better. Whereas if you go for this one, which is a non-RGB kit, they tend to be lower profile. I would go with a non-RGB kit, so one that doesn't have lighting, if you don't know what RGB is. And these will sit better underneath air coolers. And to be honest, they look better if you're using a system as an air cooler, because like it's weird to have like a bar of light coming from underneath a cooler. So I go with a lower profile kit and save yourself some money if you're going for an air cooler, but probably a RGB kit if you're going for like a all-in-one liquid cooler. But we'll talk about those in just a second. But more importantly than that, memory does have to be, it doesn't have to, but in order to get the performance that it actually says, so to get this 6,000 megahertz, you would have to overclock the RAM on most systems out today. This is very easy. So on AMD, this has an Expo profile on this particular RAM kit, if you buy the Expo version, and you go into your motherboard software and you just enable that, and then the system will restart, and as long as the motherboard is up to date and it is fully compatible with the memory, then everything will work. But you can find that overclocking RAM can cause some system instability, and then your PC won't boot, which means you'll have to manually change the settings or just leave it at the default if you run into any issues. But yes, if you're buying AMD CPU, I'd go for an Expo kit. If you're going for Intel, I'd go for what they called XMP, Extreme Memory Profile. But the two, for the most part, are cross-compatible. You're just more likely to run into issues if you use XMP on AMD and Expo on Intel boards. But generally speaking, most systems I build are absolutely fine. Well everyone, tell you what, we're making progress, we're getting there, and by the way, don't throw your components in the air. It's not big and it's not clever, but it does make great entertainment. What we're doing today, we're talking about parts today, what we're doing at this point in this video is now talking about CPU coolers, and they're more interesting than they sound because they actually have quite a big impact on your overall system. And what most people think that they do, and obviously you're right in thinking this, is that they bring the temperature of your CPU down, and the lower temperature your CPU is, the more stable it can be, the more you can overclock it. But for most people, I guess it just means you get better longevity. So you're happier if your components in general, not just your CPU, but your processor in particular, if that's running at a lower temperature, people are happier that it's going to last longer. That's not the way I think about it though, because I'm more thinking about it as, what do you need? How much money can you save by going for inferior CPU cooler, and then putting that money towards a better graphics card or better CPU again? Because something like this costs around about, on like a bad day, £200 or so. If you buy the one that has an LCD, so a screen inside it, this one can go over £200 of dollars. And you just think, well, you don't actually need this level of cooling performance on a lot of chips, and instead you could buy something like this, which is an air cooler. This is from Arctic, Freezer 36. It's my favorite air cooler at the moment, and on a good day you can get this for under £30 or dollars. Massive difference, yet the thing as well is that this can still run ridiculously quiet, because it all comes down to the TDP of the chip that you're using. So how much power this uses obviously dictates how much heat it's going to generate, and then the CPU cooler's job is to get rid of that. And the reason we've got this one on the table is because if you go for a low powered or low wattage CPU, it will come with one of these, which is a stock cooler. And this, sorry, is absolute crap. It's awful. It will suffice, but I mean, look at the size of it. It is tiny. It makes a racket. Even when you're not gaming, you're just sitting on the desktop, it's really annoying. However, as long as you get one inside the box, it is free. So what I often say is that if you're on a budget, just use this for a month or so until you get your next paycheck, and then buy something like this and then swap it out, because obviously that's going to save you a decent chunk of change. But if you're only talking about $20 to $30 anyway, it's not really the end of the world to invest in something like this from the off. And you don't have to know that much about PCs to work out that you're going to get better performance from this than you are this. And also this looks terrible, doesn't it? Like, look at the size of it. Whereas this actually has RGB and it's big and it's powerful, and you know that this is going to be good. And because you've got two fans on this particular one and they're much larger than this, the overall effect is it's going to run quieter. And for me, that's the most important thing about my system, other than the gaming performance. I want it to do it as quietly as possible. So you can tune your fans in the motherboard BIOS. And once you've tuned your fans, your system will essentially only ramp up when it needs to. Your fans will only get loud when it needs to. And the rest of the time, everything can be pretty cool and quiet. But I mean, yes, when you can get something like this for about £30 or dollars, it is definitely worth doing, but this will get you by. I'll also say that whilst the AMD stock cooler still isn't great, it is a lot better than the Intel one. So I'm more inclined to say use the stock Ryzen one for a bit if you want than I am with the Intel one. But yes, you can also go for what most, I don't know about most people, but certainly a large chunk of people are going for, which are one of these. They are AIOs, or all-in-one liquid coolers, and the way they work is pretty straightforward actually. This is obviously quite a high-end one, so it's got quite a big pump on it, and it also has some RGB inside this little block as well, so it looks nice and pretty. But it has this little contact plate on the back. This touches your CPU. You will use some thermal paste if it doesn't come pre-applied to bridge the air gap essentially between your CPU and then the cooler, and then the heat will go into this. It will be pumped through the fluid. That's not normal, I'm just bad at packing. It will go through these little tubes with the fluid into this radiator here at the top. You'll mount this to the top of your case, and then these fans will blow the heat out of your case. And obviously you will have to have more room inside your chassis to mount this, but if you went for an air cooler, you've got to make sure you have enough clearance inside your case to actually fit that in the first place. Something like this, which is quite small, most chassis should be absolutely fine. But it does go to show that regardless of the cooler you go for, do check the specifications on both your case and the cooler to make sure that they are fully compatible. Make sure you've got enough headers as well for all of the fans and things to plug in. I would advise that most people do go for an air cooler to save yourself some money, but if you do want to go for something that looks better, or you're going to ship it around and transport it a lot more often, then these all-in-ones are actually better for that, and I would advise that you go for one of those. But you don't need to spend more than like £100, £120 or dollars or so on this, and unless you actively want like an LCD or something like that. They come in different sizes as well, so you've got 120, 240, 360, because they have 120 fans on, 120mm, or obviously if you're going for like a 280 or a 420, then those are wider fans, they're 140, but you want to make sure that those will fit on your cases. So most cases will do a 240, some will do, or most will probably do a 360 if they're large enough, but certainly not a lot of them will do 420 red. So again, always check the sizes before buying a CPU cooler, and don't spend too much money on it. But while CPU coolers are surprisingly cool, let's be honest, the same really can't be said for power supplies, but they are very much an essential part of the puzzle. If you don't have one and you don't have the right one, your rig is potentially not going to work properly. And there are there's no fuel. Well, there's electricity that counts. There's a few rules of thumb really with this, and the most important one is please don't buy like a real dirt cheap power supply. I know it's very tempting to sort it from low to high, which is fine. We do that on best builds. You can find best builds right now on the top right corner of your screen, but literally don't go for the first one on the list because, you know, it depends on the unit, but generally speaking, you want to buy from a reputable brand. And there's something that's called the PSU tier list that's really helpful. We'll leave that link down below. They can help you to find the right one. But when it comes to actually choosing one that's appropriate for your system, essentially you just need to make sure that it's the right size. So this is a standard ATX power supply. We do have another one here. This one, an SFX power supply. You can also get SFX-L, which is like a mid-size one. And essentially the SFX ones go into the smaller ITX chassis, whereas pretty much all other cases, most of them will take a full-size ATX. If you go for a really high-end, high-wattage one, then they can start to get quite a bit longer. You might find that you don't have that much room around the back of the case. But for most people, again, if you're watching this, chances are you're not going to run into a problem because you're not going to be buying like a 1200 watt power supply, something like that anyway, but do bear it in mind. We'll take this one out of the box just to show you what we're talking about. This is the main number that you need to pay attention to. So this is the RM, but then this 750 is the wattage. So it's a 750 watt power supply, and it's pretty much the simple maths. You get all of the components that you're using, you add up how much power they're going to consume at their maximum, and then you buy a power supply that can actually output that so that your PC doesn't shut off, because that is something that will quite happen. I'm giving you warning, I'm going to do it now. This is not a mistake. This is what will happen if you are... Got you, didn't I? You didn't expect that. Anyway, that is genuinely what will happen if your PC has a problem with the power supply. It will usually just black screen entirely. Sometimes you might be lucky and you'll get a little warning, the game will crash and you'll say like the drive is gone or something. And if it happens consistently across different games, that's actually probably as well because your power supply is not outputting enough power to your graphics card. Whereas if it's trying to consume too much, your power supply can just shut down, you get a black screen. So yes, you need to make sure you've got enough wattage. You can use a PSU calculator to work this out, or the dirtiest way of doing this is just to look at your graphics card and see what the minimum recommended is and buy that. That's not always essential though, because that's assuming you're using like high-end components, whereas if you're using like a 50 or 60 watt CPU rather than one that's consuming 150 watts, you've obviously got that extra 100 watts of power there before you take anything else into account. But it's a good rule of thumb to buy the minimum that's on your GPU. I would also overspec it slightly if you do have it in the budget, because if you are going to upgrade your rig in the future, you might want to go for a more powerful GPU, and you probably don't want to have to replace the power supply. But yes, you've probably noticed that this doesn't actually have anything attached to it, and this is what we call a modular power supply. I'd argue most of them probably are, but certainly at the budget end, most of them aren't. It's just a money thing. In order to like pre-attach the cables, that saves you and the manufacturer money, whereas actually making them all separate costs more money. But the advantage of having it modular are pretty much twofold. Firstly, it means that you can just have a tidier build. You don't have to plug all of them in, because I can almost guarantee you will not use every single connection on this. You'll probably use half, sometimes like a third of the connections. It depends what you put inside your PC. But then the other thing, a little bit more niche, but if you do want to upgrade the cables for any reason, usually because you want something that looks fancier, like custom cable mod cables or something like that, it's just a little bit easier. You don't have to use extensions. But sometimes in the case of like ATX 3.1, PCI Gen 5, they've actually got new replacement cables for some modular power supplies, so you don't have to swap the power supply out entirely. Because what happened was when NVIDIA moved from the 30 series of GPUs to the 40, they've actually adopted this new standard, and it's called ATX3, ATX 3.1, or PCI Gen 5. And it's this one cable solution that does up to 600 watts of power. So you get one cable rather than needing 2, 3, sometimes 4 different PSU connections to your graphics card. So it's a lot tidier and easier. But if you do go for a connection like this, do make sure that you plug it in properly by pushing it as far as it will go, because it is a little bit fiddly and would be a risk if it's not plugged in properly. I realize I'm rambling, but yes, just make sure you have enough power. Make sure that it is actually rated decently for efficiency. So bronze or higher, I wouldn't worry about it too much, to be honest with you. It'll save you a bit of money if it's more efficient, but like bronze is fine. Obviously gold and like titanium, platinum, all of those are better, but yeah, I don't worry about that too much. Main thing is just that you're getting enough power, and if you are going for an NVIDIA GPU, you're buying one that does support ATX 3.1 or PCI Generation 5. But actually with that, I think that leads us on to the final two components, and I'm going to class them together because they are obviously very much related. We have our case fans and our case. Now, it's actually quite simple really, because first rule of thumb, where possible, try and make sure you have a fair bit of mesh on it. So most cases will be mesh or glass now. Just make sure you're buying a decent combination of the two. If you want the best thermals, go for mesh, but as I say, most cases that come out now pretty much have decent thermals, so I'm not too worried about it. But obviously make sure you're buying one that has the right size and right form factor for you. So this was my ITX rig for quite a few years, and I really liked this because it was flexible. So I could have this on my desk, I could work off of it. The downside was that obviously it's right next to me, so it was louder than a full-size rig. The larger it is, the more air you actually physically have inside the case, and as long as you're ventilating it properly, the lower the noise will be, because you've got less hot air inside your system, the fans don't have to work as hard, and typically an ITX rig is going to go on top of your desk, whereas if you wanted the quietest system possible, you'd have it underneath. Honestly, I don't really care what you do. A lot of people are, has to be on the desk, but like, it's your rig, do what you want. If it's on carpet, it's not ideal, because obviously you're going to pick up cat hair and stuff like that, so you have to clean it more often. But yeah, do what you want. Don't let anyone tell you. Desk is good, but obviously you need a larger size desk. But ITX is good for portability if you live across different addresses, or you like want to take your rig downstairs into your living room, something like that. That's what I did. Good for that. But most people, I'd recommend you go for micro ATX or full size ATX. If you're on a budget, micro ATX is good. You can buy a smaller chassis, it's less material, won't cost you as much, and you can buy a smaller motherboard, which is the same principle. ITX tends to get quite expensive because the tooling required is more complex, and to actually build the motherboard, again, is more complex. So it's kind of, small is good for micro ATX, but as soon as you get to ITX, it's more complicated, will cost you more money. ATX is best if you want the largest amount of features, because you don't have to worry about them cramming everything on the motherboard. If you go for micro ATX, you lose the bottom bit of the motherboard, but you keep 4 RAM slots, whereas if you go for ITX, as we saw earlier, you only have 2 RAM slots, whereas most micro ATX motherboards do have the full 4 RAM slots, so you can, as I say, upgrade your RAM a little bit later. It's kind of up to you though. There's not really that much to think about other than just compatibility. Like, do you like the way it looks? Does it have decent enough airflow? Is it built right? Like, does it feel good? Read the reviews, because obviously you can't test this. Around the back, you've got cable management as well. So the larger the gap around the back, the easier it's going to be to actually get all of the cables in place and shut the side panel. You've got 2 different classes of cases really in this day and age. You've got like a dual chamber or your standard tower, and dual chamber is very popular. I do like it a lot. Whether I would have it for my personal rig, probably not, to be honest with you, because they're a lot wider. So it's the same volume a lot of the time, but it's spread out across a wider portion rather than height. And if you're going to put this on your desk, and I have my rig on my desk, it just takes up too much room. So I prefer like a more normal case. My favorite at the moment is the Lancool 216. Love that thing, definitely highly recommended if you want to check out a case recommendation. And then I suppose you could also go for what I would call the nuclear option, which is one of these like gigantic, enormous cases, something like the Corsair 1000D, although they've just replaced it, it's the 9000D now. Phanteks NV9, anything that is huge, I would very, very cautiously tell you to stay away from those, because if you're someone that knows you need a massive case, again, you don't need me to tell you this, whereas when you're looking at things online, it's very easy to order something and then it turns up and it'll be completely the wrong size. Now, the only other thing really that we need to discuss, how many times have I said that this video, is actually to talk about fans and cooling. But this is a good example of actually like third-party fans. This is a Phanteks T30. It is fantastic, but it doesn't have any RGB, which does put people off. But these are probably my favorite overall fans if you're not too worried about aesthetic because they're very tunable, they can be very quiet, and they also have loads of performance. But if you want to go for something more RGB, then I would say my favorites are probably from Lee. These are the Uni fans. The ones I like are the AL-V2s because I think they just look quite pretty without being over the top. These are a lot more over the top. These are the SL Infinities, but crucially, the reason that I like these is because they're interlockable fans. So rather than requiring 2 different cables for every single fan in your system, you just slot them all together. They have these little contacts here, and then you just plug them into a hub. So instead of requiring 6 cables for a block of 3, you now only require 2 cables, which is pretty good. And then you control this over USB and it works out. And the reason I bring this up is because there are loads of different systems that do similar things. The Corsair one is very good as well, but it's quite expensive. But if you do want to go for a much cheaper system, then just have a look at like the base fans that Corsair sell, their new RGB ones that will just use addressable RGB. They're daisy chain, it's a lot harder to build. It's annoying, but once you've built it, it's done. Obviously, it's less of a problem. So for context, these are around about £30 or $30 or so per fan. Whereas if you buy a set of 3 Corsair RGB fans now, you can get them for £30 for 3. Quite a big difference, but you won't get the controller and stuff if you go down that route. So there's loads of different RGB fans. I'll leave some recommendations down below. But then also when you're installing them, obviously make sure that the airflow is going the way you want because they only blow in one direction. So if you're using them as an exhaust, you want them going out the back. If you're there at the top, you want them going out the top. Depends what you're going to do, but generally speaking, you go with the natural way that air rises when it gets hotter. So that's the best way of doing it. But also make sure you have enough fan headers and enough addressable RGB headers on your motherboard so you can actually plug all of these in. So yes, that is pretty much everything really. I think we need to talk about when it comes to parts. Obviously, don't overspend on fans either. £30 a fan, I would much rather put that into a better graphics card. And cases do come with fans as standard, or at least most of them do. And usually the more expensive the case, the better the fans that come with those. But it's not always the case. So do check to see what fans come with your system, how many there are. And one of the best ways of getting a better value system really is either to buy one that has no fans at all and then buy the ones you want, or if you're not that fast, just buy one that comes with some decent RGB fans as standard and then don't add any third-party ones. Keep it how it is and you should be set. That is everything I think you need to know about PC parts. If you have any questions, let us know down in the comment section below because I've tried to cover as much as I possibly can, but I'm aware it's probably not going to be literally everything. So ask away, we'll do our best to get back to you, but smash the like button if you've enjoyed this, get yourself subscribed. We'll do that full, proper, in-depth how to build a PC video that will go through literally everything in minute detail, the best we've ever done. But in the meantime, if you do want to watch PC builds, maybe with an ITX one like this, you can find that in the top right column of your screen where we'll walk you through everything. But thank you so much for watching this video. And don't forget that if you do want to check out current pricing on literally anything that was featured in this video and all of our favorite and best PC parts, you can find those listed down below with our affiliate links. And while you're down there, why not indulge yourself with the new Corsair 3500 series? Available in both black and white, with and without fans, this mighty case packs the support and cooling potential for even the most high-end rigs. Its tempered glass looks stunning, fans can be fitted on the top, side, rear and bottom, and thanks to support for rear-facing motherboards like BTF and Project Zero, your next rig can be virtually cable-free. Learn more about Corsair's 3500 series today with the link down below. But thank you guys so much for watching this video. We'll catch you in the next one.